Welcome to Chatting with Ashton. My guest is Mr. Church.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate being on here. So, Ashton, what do you want to chat about?
Let's talk about music theories.
Music theories, like
bands, yeah.
Conspiracy theories and stuff. Well, there's a bunch out there.
I know.
What do you want to talk about? Give me a band, and I'll try to see if I can.
Actually, the one that I want to know about, the Devil at the Crossroad. I know that's not a band.
Robert Johnson.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
That one intrigues me a lot.
Okay, well, there used to be a great documentary about Robert Johnson on Netflix, and I've studied it. I studied his playing. His playing's amazing. Robert Johnson was the first of what's called the 27 Club, okay, and that is famous musicians who have died either during their 27th year or right on their 27th birthday. Robert Johnson, his story is amazing because it was the beginning of mystical folklore in music.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like back in Robert Johnson's time, the preachers and everything didn't want men going to bars and listening to that kind of music because the men were spending all the money and they couldn't give the money to the church. Mm-hmm. So the preachers, don't you go to that bar and listen to that devil's music. That's why the blues became the devil's music, okay? Because the preacher man wasn't getting his cut.
Yeah.
Okay? So, Robert Johnson, it was rumored that he goes to the crossroads and he sells his soul to the devil and he disappears. And then a year later, he shows up and he's playing things that no one has ever done before. Okay? What that documentary says is that he actually went and found a guitar teacher and they would sit in a graveyard, in a cemetery at night, and they would just practice and practice and practice and practice. Because you got to think, back then, okay, Robert Johnson, his wife left him, okay? They took, she took his son away. So he didn't have nothing to do but time to study his craft, okay?
Yeah.
So that's where that kind of came from. And he was actually poisoned, but he didn't die quickly. He died a slow, painful death. And they said he was howling when he died, and that's remnants, even his lyrics, like Hellhounds on My Trail, Me and the Devil, he was the first to bring spirituality and mysticism into music.
Do you think he was really poisoned, though?
Yes, I believe he was poisoned, yes, because in the documentary it says that Robert Johnson was flirting with this barmaid, and her husband owned the bar, okay? And her husband gave Robert Johnson an opened bottle of whiskey, okay? And back then, that was a telltale sign of, okay, that label's broken. Somebody's put something in that whiskey. And actually, Robert Johnson's buddy, who was there, says, hey, don't drink that. And they tried to slap the bottle out of his hand. And Robert Johnson says, don't you ever slap a bottle of whiskey out of my hand again, and drinks it. So, yes, I believe he was poisoned because he was, flirting with, the guy's wife.
Yeah.
So,
like I said, that's a crazy story to me. I think he went and found somebody, to help him practice.
Well, and, a lot of bands there was this resurgence of Robert Johnson's music in the late 50s. And a lot of musicians, a lot of British musicians like Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, the list goes on and on and on. They loved his story and the myth. The myth about selling your soul to the crossroads. And, Led Zeppelin picked up on that, and Black Sabbath picked up on that because they wrote scary songs. They like scary movies, so they wanted to scare people with their music. Led Zeppelin did the same thing. There's those age-old stories of if you play Zeppelin backwards, you hear, words and stuff like that and all that. And, that kind of emulates Robert Johnson in a way.
Okay, so the next conspiracy theory is the Beatles.
Okay, which one? Because there's a bunch.
There is a bunch about Paul McCartney.
Oh, Paul is dead?
Yeah.
That's my favorite one. I watched a movie with my best friend, Chris Jones. If you're out there, Chris, if you ever see this, I love you, brother. It's called The Last Testament of George Harrison. And what this documentary was is that at the same time that John Lennon was shot, a man broke into George Harrison's castle and stabbed him. Supposedly, George is lying on the hospital, dying, and he asks for a tape recorder. And he records the story about how the real Paul died, and that the story goes is that the real Paul McCartney died in a car crash.
Yeah.
And a lot of Beatles songs talk about a car.
And there's an album cover.
There's several that have clues.
Yes, there's this one that I saw. It was like the pink with the flower and all that. And it's like on the front, all of them's facing towards the camera. But when you flip it around, Paul's the only one that's not looking.
Yes, and the most famous conspiracy to this is there's an album cover called Abbey Road.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Abbey. It's where they're crossing the street to go to the studio.
John Lennon is the preacher.
Yes.
And Ringo Starr is the Undertaker. No, wait. No.
Lennon's the preacher.
Uh-huh.
Ringo is the pallbearer.
Oh, yeah, pallbearer.
Paul is dead because he's barefoot and he's holding a cigarette. Now, in England, they call cigarette coffin nails.
Really?
Yes. And then George is the Undertaker. He's the gravedigger at the end. That's one clue. And there's clues in the lyrics, Paul is dead, man. I really miss him. You hear that in a song. And
sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, go ahead.
In the Abbey Road, isn't there like a white beetle in the back?
Yes, and that's the car he supposedly died in. Yes. And what happened is that the story goes is that the real Paul died, but the Queen of England didn't want to let that out because she was afraid millions of fans were going to, kill themselves.
Yeah.
Okay. So they had a Paul McCartney lookalike contest, and they never announced the winner. So.
Well, that's all for our show, y'all. That was fun.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Oh, you're so